It's been more than 40 years. 40 years of wild concerts, insane stories, and headline-making moments. But until recently, Ozzy Osbourne had kept one memory locked away. A memory so strange and intense that even he admits it still sends chills down his spine. It happened in Las Vegas, the night he came face-to-face with the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. Now Ozzy has finally broken his silence. In a rare interview, he revealed that something happened that night, something terrifying, as he puts it, that changed the way he looked at fame, music, and even himself. This wasn't just a casual backstage handshake or a polite hello between two rock stars. This was a moment that hit Ozzy so hard, it stayed with him for the rest of his life. A few short words from Elvis, whispered in the middle of a packed concert, would become a warning, a challenge, and a burden that Ozzy carried for decades. What did Elvis say to him? Why did it shake him so much? And how did it change the way Ozzy lived and made music? That's the story Ozzy is finally ready to tell. But to understand why it mattered so much, we have to go back to the summer of 1977, a time when Elvis was still filling concert halls with his legendary Vegas shows, and Ozzy was a rising star, already famous for fronting one of the loudest, darkest, and most rebellious bands in the world, Black Sabbath. It was a night that started with excitement and ended with a single sentence that Ozzy could never forget. It was a warm July evening in Las Vegas, 1977. The neon lights of the Strip glowed against the desert sky, and inside the International Hotel, every seat was taken. Fans in suits, dresses, and glittering jewelry filled the grand showroom, buzzing with anticipation for the king of rock and roll. Back then, an Elvis Presley concert wasn't just a show, it was an event. The moment the lights dimmed and the first notes rang out, the crowd roared as if the building itself might shake apart. In the third row sat a 28-year-old Ozzy Osbourne. At this point, Black Sabbath was already making waves across the world with their heavy, thunderous sound. But this was different. Ozzy had grown up listening to Elvis. This was the man who had inspired generations of musicians, including him, to pick up a microphone in the first place. Ozzy didn't come to Vegas as a guest of honor. He was just there to watch, quietly, blending in as best he could. But when Elvis hit the stage, dressed in his iconic white jumpsuit with gold embellishments shining under the spotlights, Ozzy couldn't take his eyes off him. The king moved across the stage with that effortless charm only he had. He sang "Can't Help Falling in Love" like he was singing it for each person in the room individually. Ozzy was spellbound. Then it happened. As the song ended, Elvis paused. His eyes swept across the crowd, then stopped. Right on Ozzy. A small smile spread across Elvis's face. He adjusted the microphone and in that deep, unmistakable voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got royalty in the house tonight. The Prince of Darkness himself, Mr. Ozzy Osbourne." The audience erupted in cheers and applause. Ozzy felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He froze for a second. This wasn't in the plan, but Elvis wasn't done. "Ozzy, why don't you come up here and join me?" The room exploded. People clapped, whistled, and chanted his name. Ozzy's heart pounded. Part of him wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. The other part knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Slowly, he stood up. The crowd parted as he made his way toward the stage, not yet knowing that what awaited him there would become one of the most unforgettable moments of his life. The lights seemed brighter once Ozzy's boots hit the stage. He wasn't just walking toward Elvis Presley, he was walking into a moment that would be talked about for decades. The crowd's applause swelled, echoing through the massive showroom. Some people cheered because they recognized Ozzy. Others just sensed they were about to witness something unusual, the king of rock and roll sharing his stage with the Prince of Darkness. Elvis stepped forward with that easy smile, holding out his hand. Ozzy shook it firm, but with a nervousness he couldn't hide. Elvis leaned in and said, "Good to see you, my friend," his voice warm enough to melt some of the tension in Ozzy's chest. They stood there side by side, and the contrast was striking. Elvis, in his spotless white jumpsuit, the gold studs sparkling under the spotlight, radiated a kind of old-school glamour. Ozzy, on the other hand, looked like he'd just stepped out of a smoky rock club, black leather jacket, long dark hair, and a stare that could cut through steel. The audience loved it, two worlds colliding. "I've been listening to your band, Black Sabbath," Elvis said into the mic. That's some powerful stuff you've got there. Ozzy managed a small grin. And I've been listening to you all my life, mate. The crowd roared at the exchange. Elvis turned to his band, the legendary TCB band, and said, "Let's give them something special tonight." A few nods and the musicians were ready. The opening riff of Hound Dog filled the room, but it was different, heavier, grittier. The guitars had more bite, the drums hit harder. Elvis's voice still carried that familiar swagger, but now it had an edge that matched Ozzy's darker tone. They traded lines, laughing between verses, feeding off each other's energy. Ozzy slipped in little vocal growls, giving the song a rougher texture, and Elvis leaned into it, pushing his own delivery harder. From the outside, it looked like a perfect jam session, two legends having the time of their lives, but inside, Ozzy felt something off. He couldn't explain it at first. Maybe it was the way Elvis kept glancing at him, as if searching for the right moment to say something. Maybe it was the sudden intensity in his eyes during the choruses, like he wasn't just singing, he was sizing Ozzy up. As the song built to its finale, Elvis stepped closer, close enough that the crowd probably thought it was just part of the act. Ozzy could smell the faint scent of cologne and sweat. Then, without warning, Elvis stopped singing. The band kept playing softly. The spotlight seemed to tighten on the two of them. Elvis gripped Ozzy's shoulder with surprising strength and leaned in, his voice low but still caught faintly by the microphone. And that's when it happened, the words. Words Ozzy wouldn't repeat for 40 years. His smile faltered, his voice caught in his throat, and for the first time in a long time, Ozzy felt genuinely rattled. The audience, they just saw two rock icons sharing a private joke, but Ozzy knew it wasn't a joke, not at all. The crowd laughed lightly, thinking Elvis had whispered something cheeky, maybe a playful jab at Ozzy's dark image or a silly lyric swap. But Ozzy wasn't laughing. His pulse was hammering. The words Elvis had said weren't funny. They weren't casual. They were heavy, almost like a warning. And the way Elvis looked at him while saying them, eyes locked, voice steady, made it clear he meant every syllable. But here's the thing, no one else in that room understood. The band kept playing. Fans kept clapping along. Photographers kept snapping away. Ozzy tried to sing his next line, but his voice was shaky. He forced himself through it, not wanting to let the audience see his reaction. Inside, though, his mind was spinning. What did Elvis mean by that? Why tell me now, in front of thousands of people? And how could he possibly know something like that? Elvis, on the other hand, went right back into performance mode. He flashed that famous crooked grin, spun the microphone stand, and belted out the last verse of Hound Dog like nothing had happened. But every so often, his eyes would flick back to Ozzy, as if checking to see if the message had landed. By the time the song ended, Ozzy was holding his composure by a thread. The applause was deafening, but to him it sounded far away, muffled, like his ears were underwater. Elvis grabbed his hand, raised it high, and shouted to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the Prince of Darkness." The audience roared. Ozzy smiled weakly and gave a small wave. On the surface, it looked like a triumphant meeting of two legends, but inside, Ozzy couldn't wait to get off that stage. Backstage, Elvis was already there, towel around his neck, sipping water. He greeted Ozzy like nothing unusual had happened. "Good to have you up there, son," he said warmly. Ozzy didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to demand an explanation. Another part hesitated, worried about hearing more. The room was busy, band members chatting, crew moving equipment, so he stayed quiet. But as the night went on, those words kept replaying in his head, over and over. And here's the part that made it truly terrifying. What Elvis had told him wasn't about that night. It wasn't even about their music. It was about Ozzy's future, a future Elvis seemed to see with unnerving clarity. Years later, Ozzy would say that he couldn't explain how Elvis knew what he knew. He never met him before that evening. They'd never spoken on the phone, never exchanged letters. And yet, Elvis had looked at him as if he could read his soul in an instant. It was a short sentence. No threats, no insults, but it landed like a prophecy, one Ozzy wasn't sure he wanted to believe. For decades, he kept it to himself, telling no one. Fans speculated, fellow musicians asked, but Ozzy stayed silent. Until one day, 40 years later, when he finally decided the world needed to know exactly what Elvis Presley had whispered to him that night on stage in Las Vegas. And when he revealed it, people finally understood why it had haunted him all those years. The lights faded. The roar of the crowd softened into background noise as Ozzy stepped off stage, his boots landing on the carpeted walkway that led backstage. He could still feel the heat of the spotlights on his skin, but it wasn't the lights that made him sweat. It was the words. Elvis's words. They were still echoing in his head, clear as if they'd just been spoken a second ago. The backstage area was buzzing with activity. Technicians wheeled out equipment, band members chatted and laughed, and waitresses from the showroom passed by carrying trays. But for Ozzy, it all felt distant, almost muted, as though he were watching it happen from underwater. He spotted Elvis sitting on a leather couch in the corner, a white towel draped over his shoulders, sipping water from a glass. The king looked calm, even cheerful, like the entire show had been nothing more than another night at the office. "Ozzy, my boy," Elvis called out, his voice warm and booming. "You did great out there." Ozzy forced a smile and walked over, still trying to decide if he should bring up what had happened on stage. He sat down in the chair across from Elvis, leaning forward slightly. "Thanks, mate," he said, "but back there what you said." Before he could finish, Elvis handed him a cold drink. "It's all part of the show, son. You handled it well." Part of the show? Ozzy knew that wasn't true. There had been something in Elvis's eyes, something dead serious when he'd spoken those words. It wasn't an act. Elvis changed the subject quickly, asking about Black Sabbath's latest album, their tour, the crowds in Europe. He laughed, joked, and told a few stories from his early days on the road. To anyone listening, it was just two musicians bonding over a shared love of music. But Ozzy's mind kept drifting back. The more Elvis avoided the topic, the more certain Ozzy became that it hadn't been a throwaway comment. The king wasn't going to explain it, at least, not here, not now. Eventually, a member of Elvis's team came over to say the press was waiting for him. Elvis stood, shook Ozzy's hand again, and said, "You're going to be fine, son. Just remember what I told you." And then he was gone, just like that. Ozzy sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where Elvis had been standing. He felt a strange mixture of confusion, respect, and unease. The message had been delivered, but the meaning was something he'd have to figure out for himself. That night back in his hotel room, Ozzy couldn't sleep. The words replayed over and over. He thought about his career, the choices he'd made, the battles ahead. Somehow, Elvis's warning felt personal, as if he'd looked directly into Ozzy's future and seen the dangers waiting there. And maybe that's what made it so terrifying. Not the words themselves, but the feeling that they were true. For decades, Ozzy Osbourne kept that moment locked away in his mind. He tells stories about his time with Elvis, sure, the duet, the crowd, the laughter, but he never shared the story, the real one. Fans speculated for years. Some said Elvis had told Ozzy to cut his hair. Others joked he'd warned him to stop biting the heads off bats. The truth was far from either and far more serious. In 2017, during a long, in-depth interview, the subject of Elvis came up. The interviewer asked the usual questions. What was it like to meet him? What did you talk about? Ozzy gave his standard answers at first. Then there was a pause. He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant, almost like he was weighing whether to finally open that locked door in his memory. And then he said quietly, "You know, there's something I've never told anyone about that night." The room went silent. Even the interviewer froze, sensing the weight of what was coming. Elvis leaned in and said to me, "They're going to try to tame you. Don't let them. The moment you stop being dangerous, you stop being real." Ozzy's voice dropped even lower as he continued. "It wasn't a joke. He said it like it was life or death, like he knew exactly what was coming my way." For the first time in 40 years, the secret was out. Ozzy explained that the terrifying part wasn't the words themselves. It was the way Elvis said them. The intensity in his eyes, the quiet certainty in his tone, and the fact that he seemed to see Ozzy's future with complete clarity. "He knew the industry," Ozzy said. "He knew what it would try to do to me, what it had probably already done to him. It was like he was passing me a warning, or maybe even a torch." The interviewer asked why he'd kept it to himself for so long. Ozzy shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe I thought people wouldn't understand. Maybe I didn't even understand it myself for a long time." But over the years, he realized how true those words were. He'd faced pressure from record labels, management, the press, all trying to reshape him into something more predictable, more polished, less Ozzy. And every time he stood his ground, those words from Elvis came back to him. They're going to try to tame you, don't let them. It wasn't just about music. It was about identity, about staying authentic in a world that rewards conformity. As Ozzy finished the story, there was a moment of silence in the room. Not awkward silence, the kind where everyone present feels the weight of what they've just heard. The king of rock and roll had given the Prince of Darkness more than just a memorable night on stage. He'd given him a rule to live by. And for Ozzy, that rule had been worth protecting for 40 years. Ozzy Osbourne didn't realize it at the time, but that single moment with Elvis Presley would end up shaping nearly every major decision he made in his career. In the early years after that Vegas night, life moved fast. Black Sabbath continued to dominate the rock scene, but with fame came pressure. Record labels wanted more radio-friendly tracks. Managers pushed for a cleaner image. Publicists begged him to tone down the wild behavior that had become part of his legend. Every time one of those conversations happened, Ozzy would hear Elvis's voice in his head. The moment you stop being dangerous, you stop being real. Sometimes it was a whisper, other times it was like a shout. Either way, it always pulled him back to his core. In the 1980s, when Ozzy began his solo career, the pressure was even greater. He just parted ways with Black Sabbath, and everyone had an opinion on what he should do next. Some suggested softer music to reach a bigger audience. Others told him to ditch the dark themes and shock factor that made him famous. But Ozzy knew exactly who he was. The world didn't need another polished, predictable rock star. It needed someone raw, unpredictable, and unapologetically himself. And so, even when it meant pushing boundaries and sometimes crossing them, he stayed true to that identity. Of course, being dangerous didn't mean reckless for the sake of it. Over the years, Ozzy learned to channel that edge into his music and performances in ways that connected deeply with fans. His concerts became legendary for their energy and unpredictability, and his albums carried a distinct voice that no label executive could smooth over. Looking back, Ozzy admits that without Elvis's words, he might have been tempted to compromise more. "It's easy to get worn down," he said. "You do enough shows, enough interviews, and people keep telling you to change it, you start thinking maybe they're right. But then I'd hear his voice in my head, and I knew I couldn't." That stubbornness, or, as Ozzy prefers to call it, conviction, became his armor. It kept him grounded when fame tried to twist him into something he was. It also helped him connect with fans in a way that felt personal. They knew he wasn't putting on an act. He was giving them the real Ozzy, flaws and all. And in the years that followed, as younger rock and metal musicians began to rise, Ozzy became something of a mentor. He offered advice to up-and-coming bands, and without even realizing it, he often repeated the very lesson Elvis had given him. "Stay dangerous," he'd say. "Don't let anyone take the teeth out of your music." It wasn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was about authenticity. The moment you lose that, the moment you start playing it safe just to fit in, the magic is gone. For Ozzy, Elvis's warning wasn't just a moment in music history. It was a compass, and for 40 years, that compass never failed him. The story of that night in 1977 isn't just about two music legends meeting on a stage in Las Vegas. It's about a private exchange that carried more weight than either of them could have known at the time. Elvis Presley didn't live long after that evening. Within weeks, the world would lose the king of rock and roll. But before he left, he gave Ozzy Osbourne a gift, not in the form of a guitar, a song, or even a collaboration, but in the form of words that would echo for decades. For Ozzy, the terrifying part of that moment wasn't fear of Elvis. It was the realization that greatness comes with a price. Staying true to yourself means resisting the constant pull to conform, even when that resistance makes life harder. It's a truth that applies far beyond music. Whether you're an artist, a business owner, or just someone trying to live authentically, the world will always try to tame you, to make you easier to handle, easier to market, easier to fit into a box. But the moment you give in completely, you lose something you can't get back. When Ozzy finally revealed Elvis's words after 40 years, fans understood why he'd kept them to himself for so long. It wasn't a casual piece of stage banter. It was a passing of the torch, a legend telling another to keep the fire alive. Even now, when Ozzy steps on stage, you can see it in the way he moves and the way he commands a crowd. He's not interested in being safe. He's interested in being real. And maybe that's the true legacy of that night. Not the performance itself, but the reminder that authenticity will always outlast trends. Elvis knew it. Ozzy learned it. And now, after all these years, we get to learn it too. As Ozzy once put it, that night Elvis told me the truth, and I've been chasing it ever since. So maybe the question isn't just what Elvis told Ozzy, but what we'd do if someone told us the same thing. Would we have the courage to stay dangerous? If this story has made you think, tell me in the comments. What do you think Elvis meant that night? And more importantly, what does it mean to you? Because in the end, the real power of this story is that it isn't just about music history, it's about life, and the choices we make when the world tries to tame us.